What's up, gamers? Welcome back to the Hideaway. I am your host, Don Hovino, the Hovsmeister, and today we are having a spoilery discussion of the ending, and I guess a general retrospective of the Jump series, The Promised Neverland. And for those who don't know, I, myself, and many of my co-hosts here all of my co-hosts here, we had a recurring live stream for about a year where we discussed each of the Jump series, and The Promised Neverland was one of those. So, I will introduce my co-hosts here. We have Grail.
Hello.
Dr. Nova.
Good morning. Well, morning for me.
And my most regular podcast co-hosting bud, Wensleydale.
Hello.
How are you all doing, by the way?
Pretty good, aside the heat wave and no rain coming in for the next 10 days.
I mean, I'm doing rotten. The world has gone to shit, but I'm very excited to talk about the series since, like, the big episode we did with Chris about The Promised Neverland. It'll be great to gauge how much our opinions, or if at all, our opinions changed since that time.
Taking it one day at a time, but this morning I'm feeling decent enough and couldn't really sleep that well. So, halfway through you might hear me just like softly dozing in the background. But that also could be because we're talking about The Promised Neverland.
Yeah, myself, I've been doing alright. I've recently watched through all of The Midnight Gospel, which is a very interesting Netflix series. It's by Pendleton Ward, the creator of Adventure Time.
Ooh.
And it's not for everyone, but I think it's a very interesting series because it's very experimental. It kind of feels like people recorded conversations of people while they were stoned and then made an episode around it that was just as psychedelic and weird. And I can imagine, I think it's cool that it exists because it allows for more experimental animated shows, and it's also probably got a good audience because, I mean, I can't confirm myself, of course, because Hovin with an H is a good Christian channel that does not condone the use of drugs, but I have a feeling it might be quite good to watch while high. So yeah, that's what I've been up to.
Don't do drugs, kids. And don't implement laws that unfairly target people of color for the use of drugs.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, definitely. Anyway, so to get into the main topic, so first of all, I think we should all go over our general thoughts on The Promised Neverland. And I guess I'll start on that front. The Promised Neverland, for me, it's a series that I did really like for the initial Gracefield House arc, and then I sort of slowly fell out of love with it, and I've developed kind of a bitterness towards it, somewhat irrationally, I'd say, because just as I fell out of love with it, which was around the Goldie Pond arc, that was when a certain clique of shonen Twitter got very elitist about this series, and it kind of became this sort of special thing, like that stands above all the other Jump series, and it's so smart and clever, and there was also very much kind of a mystery box thing surrounding this series because people don't want to spoil both the initial reveal that they're actually being eaten by demons, and then what happens once they get out of the orphanage. So I found the discussion surrounding it kind of annoying, and so then when everyone else started to get disappointed with this series, which was around, like, the climax in the invasion of the city, I'm like, oh, so now you're on the same page as me, right?
Now we can be elitist.
So, yeah, it's a series that I had a lot of somewhat unfair bitterness towards. I gotta say, recently I have made peace with it a bit more, in revisiting the earlier material. But yeah, and I guess going into the climax of this series, I thought it offered a very interesting moral quandary with what Norman wanted to do with the demons versus Emma's very pacifist response, and I wanted to see that resolved in an interesting way. That's what I wanted out of it. What were other people's general thoughts going into the climax, I guess?
For the climax, well, I would have to put it like this. My thoughts in the series are like a really good dip in a roller coaster. It starts just going down and I'm screaming excitement, but slowly the incline seems to get more and more even. So it's still fun, and until it's just on a flat surface and not moving. And I just don't have any care because this is not fun, this is not bad enough to get me interested. It's just there. And that's kind of why I had no expectations for the ending, so it could not disappoint me or really thrill me either, because I think some parts could have worked if I still had any investment and wasn't just on my phone waiting for this thing to be over.
What about you, Nova?
We'll get into this more later, but the thing that I thought was good about the Promised Neverland died a long time ago. So it was definitely the issue for me of being like, I'm not going to say that the end... I didn't go into the ending thinking that, like, oh, this is going to be an absolute train wreck. But I was kind of very aware that it wasn't going to be what I wanted it to be. So I did kind of check out to some degree going into it. But, you know, like any series ending, I'm always curious to see how it goes, because I feel like, especially lately, we've kind of gotten into the habit of thinking that shonen endings are going to suck. Because it's definitely become like a common thing in the genre just to be like, yeah, that series was good, but God, like, that ending sucked. Like, we're sort of, we had that issue with Soma. There's the debate around We Never Learn right now in terms of how they're handling that. And
yeah, I'm probably going to do a podcast episode on that when it finally wraps up as well.
And so, you know, it was definitely just sort of unfortunate to be like, yeah, here's another, like, check mark onto that theory.
Okay, so, and then last of all, Wensleydale, I believe you have quite a substantial amount to say about your thoughts on the series and its ending, so why don't you go into that for us?
Yeah, my thoughts on the series, I mostly shared my thoughts on the series with the rest of you. I thought it was really good in the Gracefield arc, and for how we say that the endings in shonen manga usually suck, in this case, the ending were like 3/4 of the series. But there is something about the Promised Neverland ending that makes me feel weird. For the longest time, I couldn't connect with any characters that were introduced. In tandem with Kaio Shirai's, for the most part, individualistic storytelling, it meant that only Emma could make any genuine connection with them, which in turn resulted in me feeling sick of her blind optimism and her hope for a peaceful resolution to everything, even if I admire and want to share her values. Maybe this was due to the oversaturation of her presence throughout the story, with no side characters of much importance to balance it out. Maybe it's the lack of challenge she and her flock of sheep has faced since Gracefield. Maybe it just feels less clever now that conflict is solved by use of firearms instead of, mind games. It seems bizarre that in my head, when I hear the Promised Neverland, I still want to say, oh yeah, it's one of the best series in recent Shonen Jump, even if my positive feelings about it mostly end with the Gracefield arc. To be fair, I do want to say that upon reading through the series again, I found it much better in bulk than week to week. But as I've said on Manga Mosaic before, I think I'm more of a binge reader in general. And it's true, I can't deny how enjoyable the Gracefield arc was to read, but looking back on it, I have to stress that it was a very faulty Act 1 to the series. Out of the 7 major characters that were introduced, 2 seemingly didn't survive it, 2 were severely underdeveloped and were never important again. 1 got left behind, and 1, Ray, culminated his character arc so early on that he was functionally a non-entity throughout the rest of the story. This left only Emma for us to latch on to, and to be honest, she's not a character that evolves a lot later. Rather, she becomes this beacon of hope to one character, and then another, and always closing this distance between her and the other characters the same way. You could say that she does this over and over again, while all I want to do is meet her other friends. And yet, Emma and her tedious flock of sheep notwithstanding, I felt an emotional connection there with the last few chapters that I can't adequately justify. Like 5 years ago, if someone showed me Emma's speech to Peter Archery, I would have called it pretentious and moved on with my life. Now I can't see it as that. I felt a raw, visceral reaction to the world turning rotten, and as it does, you can't do anything, and it's frustrating, and there's really no pretense about it. I felt like I was able to get something out of my mind that I repressed for a long time. And for how I very often feel like I'm surrounded by people trying to be Emma, being like, oh, hold tight, we'll survive, we will get through this. The ending of The Promised Neverland feels very validating in defiance of that. It very much feels like Kayoshirai is like, yeah, there is more than a small chance that you won't survive this, that you'll be dead. This world is headed to shit and you can't escape it. In fact, this world is probably worse than you see in this series. You see some hope? Well, sucks to be you. It'll probably be a decade or more before we'll get our shit together. Now, at the same time, I realize that Shirai and Amizu didn't intend that to come across as that, since they do leave the kids with a happy ending, and I don't blame them for it. First of all, it's Shonen Jump, and second of all, yeah, they do deserve it. And I don't think it mars this connection for me. The absurdity of some of the things that happen, because, yeah, they are quite absurd, like the demons unanimously agreeing to not eat meat and to eliminate the farms, and with no opposition whatsoever. Well, it's too removed from reality to bother me about being in conflict with this kind of message. And now that I think about it, it kind of works in favor of it, as paradoxically the world where the demons have farms of humans that they breed them to eat is kind of the escapist one, instead of the one the kids are trying to go to. And I still think that the price Emma had to pay was, even though it all ended well, it was thematically appropriate to this connection I felt. The world may get better, but you won't be here to see it. Anyway, this is completely absurd, but here's some hope. Enjoy it while it lasts.
That was very nicely put. And you guys thought we couldn't get Hideaway Rambles onto the main Hideaway. Yeah, no, because for me, this ending, it's the right ending. I have issues and reservations with the way it was handled, with the execution. Like, I do like the fact that Emma loses her memories and she does actually give something up. The problem is, everything about the framing that Shirai's and Kozuka's framing is either so overwhelmingly happy or so overwhelmingly sad, and there's never any room for, like, nuance. Which I think sometimes can be used to great dramatic effect. Like, one example of where I really, really liked this was when they first met Norman again. I really liked that because it feels emotionally genuine to what they'd be feeling. They have this big rush of, oh, we're so happy to see Norman again, we finally ate together and slept together again, and it's this big emotional rush that these kids have of seeing their friend for the first time in ages, and after thinking he was dead. And then you have, like, the rug pull moment of, actually, Emma doesn't want to annihilate all the demons, and, you know, we don't want to, and like, she's been holding these feelings back, and she doesn't know what to do with them. And, like, I think that's quite an effective use of that, whereas a lot of the framing of both redemptions and of the way this series ended were very either universally happy or universally tragic, without any middle ground. And it didn't really feel appropriate there.
Yeah, I totally get while it would kind of even... Now that I think about it, it may have kind of even ruined that moment for me. Whereas I would have thought it appropriate, but yeah, there's no really much differentiation there.
Yeah, and I think one of the tragic endings that really didn't work was with Isabella, but I think we'll get to that when we get to
we're kind of in an... We're sort of generally talking about the ending, but we can go back and forth on different ideas. And yeah, I remember when it happened, Isabella's sudden death really pissed me off, because it's like, you have this morally grey character, and it's interesting to see where she goes, but it kind of goes from all the children just accept her and are totally fine with it to but then she has to die in order to be redeemed, and she is totally redeemed. And in order to do that, we had to grab like a demon that we'd never seen before, out of nowhere. Whereas prior, it just seemed like all the demons were totally on board with abolishing the farms. And both of the demons that were established characters who were really obsessed with hunting, which were, I think it was Mujika and... Wait, is it Mujika or Sonju?
Sonju.
Sonju and Luvis are
Fucking
both
Luvis!
redeemed and elsewhere. Fucking Luvis! And so...
Yeah. Did they even show Musica again? No, it's Sanju after the whole capture thing.
Yeah, it's like, where did his whole thing about wanting to hunt again go? That was just kind of... did I miss something, or did they just kind of drop it?
I think he has a panel where he like says, okay, I'm really frustrated about this girl, but I guess I'll play along.
Yeah.
I think with all the complexity and question rates they built up, the ending with the demons was just way too clean. Like, I'm not opposed to that sort of thing, but they raise these questions. Then you can't just ignore them when you bring them up.
Yeah. And again, it's like, I think I don't on paper mind Emma's simplified like optimism versus the cruel harshness of the world being opposed against each other and having her win. It's just, you need to slightly broaden the questions and maybe the opposite, narrow the questions and simplify the threats a little in order to make that work. For example, one motif that I do like a lot with the way that Emma's victories are handled is the fact that sometimes her plans go awry, but it's her kindness and the way she endears herself to other people that end up being the missing piece. Like, that's why I like the fact that the moms and Isabella end up supporting her in the end, even when it seems like she's at the end of her rope with Ratri outsmarting her. And I like that motif. That's like, it's a nice way to realise her goals without having her be endlessly good at her plans. But yeah. Nova, do you have any thoughts on the ending as a whole?
I'm very, very split. Because there are parts of it... Here's the thing. The big argument I've seen from people is that it's too easy. And there are certain parts of it that I agree with. And there are certain parts of it that I don't. And do I agree that the whole, like... oh, Luvis makes a speech to, like, 40 people in one demon city, and then the entire world is just like, well, I guess we should stop eating that. Like, okay, no, that does seem a little bit easy, particularly because we've only really seen, like, a France-sized portion of the demon world.
Yeah, I would also say that the demons are fucking sheep. Like, first they're... the evil blood, the blood is evil. It must be killed. Yeah. Actually, it's not evil. Our farm should be abolished. Yeah. They just go with whatever the last guy said.
But some people also sort of said just like, well, and you know, this was back when we were under the impression that the weird like demon baby god thing was like, oh, I don't need any price to change the promise.
Oh, you mean?
Yeah. The drowning Daffy Duck sound. Yeah, the choking Daffy Duck sound. But the thing is, at the time, I was actually completely for that because I like to look at conflicts from a perspective of basic humanity because I find that particularly in manga these days, is kind of getting lost, where everything has to be, like, quote-unquote logical, and has to, like, make sense in terms of, like, commerce, and basic humanity gets lost. So I was kind of completely for the person being like, hey, you know, the price is probably the fact that, like, we've had a controlled genocide on your people for hundreds upon hundreds of years, and asking you to now, like, make me a hamburger is kind of like the definition of privilege. So maybe we should just be like, yeah, you can go. like, that kind of made sense to me just based on, like, because, okay, to go back in Promised Neverland for a little while, the basic premise of the Promised Neverland was always slightly flawed, in the sense that the way it was explained was like, we demons wanted to eat humans, so we ate them all the time. However, the humans started to kill us because we were eating them. So really, it was wrong on both sides when you think about it. And like, no, it wasn't wrong on both sides. The demons were murdering humans, and the humans didn't give a fuck about the demons until they started killing them.
Well, it wasn't that they wanted to eat the humans. It was that if they didn't eat the humans, then they lost their minds, basically. Like, who they were would die as they degenerate.
Again, that wasn't how it was explained at the time. We sort of found that out later on. Yeah, that's sort of how we found that out later on. But it was just sort of the way it was presented, in the sense that, like, it was sort of presented as, like, wrongs on both sides coming together to make a right. And it was sort of like, the humans were really just being like, hey, can you not murder all of us, maybe?
I guess to go into, we have a few questions for a Q&A segment, which I'm going to save most of them for the end. But I guess the first one, it's where did it went wrong is an interesting wrong. Yes, this Reddit user did spell it that way. Because I feel like we've typically had a very different response to a lot of the manga community, whereas there is one camp that feels like this series distinctly went wrong at, like, the final arc, whereas we started to have reservations on it at the Goldie Pond arc. And I think one thing I've noticed in rereading it is I don't really mind the shift in genre and at Goldie Pond, because it does definitely go through quite an abrupt genre shift, where it's sort of guns blazing, rifle combat and all that. I don't mind it in theory. It's the fact that it's so abrupt, because Promised Neverland has always had an element of genre fusion to it, and a lot of that I quite like. Like, it has this warped fairy tale fantasy aesthetic that is also fused with an element of sci-fi, and the sci-fi elements are kind of vaguely explained, and I like that they're vaguely explained. And I like the blending of it in some instances, like the seven walls and the way that fuses the two, and then the actual Goldie Pond, where it's like they have like a door with a scientific computer room, futuristic, and then they move on and you find like a fantasy pond inside of it. So yeah, I wouldn't have minded the fact that they moved on to and we have guns. It's just I'd have rather they were implemented more slowly.
I would say the single chapter where I think I started to really dislike this series was with that one girl with a beanie. I'm not gonna bother trying to remember her name because this series cast got bloated. But that one girl with a beanie just stood up on a branch, dual-wielding machine guns or assault rifles to be accurate, and just firing on the demons. Because as someone who has actually fired those things,
that was
I know
my
how
favorite
bullshit
chapter.
That is for a little kid to be doing.
That was one of my favorite chapters in the entire series. Just to, like, compare that to, like, early on when, like, it was actually, like, a thing they had to account for the fact that, like, they were children and they weren't actually physically strong, so they couldn't overpower Mom and they had to think of other ways, to cutting to now when there's, like, a 12-year-old dual-wielding machine guns.
Yeah, and that's also one thing I would say about Goldie Pond going wrong is that's where the cast really began to get bloated. When they had actual characters with actual names weren't just part of the background cast. Or, well, not just that, actual names and somewhat established histories and personalities.
It's like, I remember there was that one kid with, like, the goggles who was doing a huge thing about, oh no, Zack might be dead. I remember all these things about Zack, and then he does a huge flashback telling us and not showing us. And I don't necessarily believe in show don't tell in all cases. Like, it's very much an American cultural rule that isn't necessarily an absolute, but in this case it is just annoying. that I'd have rather have seen this character's perspective for a while than just be told all about them, or just be told purely from the perspective of this is what it means to Goggle Kid.
Or at least tell us before the thing has happened. Don't tell us afterwards how important
That's
was.
kind of what I'm. I kind of answered this question in my big monologue, but yeah, there could be a few moments where I have given up to a certain extent on the series. Like, for example, the chapter where they got guns. For example, the chapter when Ray was lit, and from then on, for quite a few dozen chapters, the series heavily relied on end of chapter pretty forced cliffhangers in the forest arc.
Okay, that's interesting, because on a reread, I really liked the forest arc, actually. I remember being more positive on it when we were covering it on Stammer Stream, and I think it actually holds up quite well. I really like details, like world-building details, like the Goopna flower, where it's like, it's both it's both used in religious hunting ceremonies, and it preserves the meat. Because I think that's quite an interesting, that's a good way to convey like a detail like religious practices, because a lot of religious practices in the real world often correlate to good ways to preserve meat, or particular diseases that were found within meat that are found within meat prepared wrong, and that sort of thing. So yeah,
I'm not saying that I wouldn't change my mind if I reread this arc, and unfortunately, in preparation for this podcast, I only managed to reread the last arc in its entirety. But overall, I think that yeah, mostly why I couldn't connect with the series afterwards, after Gracefield, was due to how Gracefield established its cast, how it neglected Don Gilder basically until the kind of maneuvers against Norman as they were searching for Sonja and Mujika, which if this was how they were trying to outsmart him, I feel like I'd enjoy it more. But it did get resolved rather quickly, unfortunately. How most of the interesting characters got left behind, and how later on only Emma and Ray in tandem with her were able to have any interesting interactions, any interesting dynamics with the new characters they met, and how the extended cast got mostly treated as a crowd rather than characters in their own right. How the Gracefield kids even suddenly got treated as, oh no, Chris is dying. We love Chris so much. Chris was always so important with us. He was here from the start. But since he's not really important to the reader, it didn't really hit us hard, unfortunately.
Yeah, because that's the thing. That's something that I think Shirai has, or at least Shirai's editors, I don't remember which, has been quite upfront about in an interview, that Promised Neverland is not a character-driven series, it's a plot-driven one. And I think that can work when the plot framework is really good. I think Death Note is a good example of this, where it's more driven around like a specific set of rules and how the cat and mouse game works within those rules. And then I think this is similar with the dynamic that the Gracefield house arc had, where you had that cat and mouse game between Isabella and the kids, and so it sort of paints over the problems of the secondary cast being not very fleshed out, because it's like, okay, we still have this cool conflict and this very effective villain, so it doesn't really matter, whereas, like, the genre shift did kind of affect my opinion on that as well, and how the extended cast were utilised.
Yeah, it was really effective while it was a short series, and I think I remember that we had this conversation with Castor where he was like very iffy on whether this series could survive a genre shift. I was, oh no. Well, I think it'd be interesting to explore this world. I mean, it could theoretically work.
I mean, to go back to my thing on the guns, I don't mind that they introduced them or used them prominently. I'd have kind of liked it if maybe the Goldie Pond arc had it so that they had some occasional use of rifles, but because they're all kids who are relatively new to them, it's like they can't wholly rely on them, and sometimes shots will go wrong, so they need to rely on like traps and stuff as well to deal with the demons.
Yeah, just be the Ewoks.
Yeah, be the Ewoks. Because like by the end of the series, when we get to that final arc with storming Gracefield House, I am totally cool with everyone like completely loaded to the gills. Like that's fine because you're at the climax at that point and they've had time to train, and also you have adult characters present. Because like that's one thing I like about a series that this often gets another series this often gets compared to, Attack on Titan. I do kind of like the way that in that series, issues with it aside, which are very notable, they do kind of evolve the way that they take care of the Titans, and that's a very slow burn. However, at the start they have the simple means of the 3D maneuver gear and the like giant Stanley knives, and then they get new technology to take them down and new means to take them down as it goes along. So I quite like that slow shift to different kinds of weaponry, just let it occur more naturally.
So here's the thing.
Yeah.
When I hear that a series is more plot-driven and isn't character-driven, I think sometimes people mistake that for not having characters, period. Which is kind of what happened in the Promised Neverland, because when I think of a series that is plot-driven but not character-driven, the characters exist. They're just very simple and clear as to who the characters are. You know, if this character's like a hothead, then they act that way. They're a very hot-headed character. And maybe once in a while you'll see them like the peek behind the curtain, but for the most part that's their personality. You get clear characters who maybe don't necessarily have depth, but who you can name, oh yeah, that's how that character acts. Promised Neverland didn't, after a certain point. Not because... And this is where I think the failing was. If you don't want to be a character-driven series, that's fine. But I'm of the opinion that in the Gracefield House arc, that's just flat out not true. I do not think you can look at that arc and say that, oh yeah, the characters are just there to serve the story. Absolutely not. If anything, it is a huge character exploration on Emma, Ray, and Norman. And when you leave, then, it just sort of becomes this herd of characters who all kind of have the same interchangeable personality, and yet we're meant to have not only individual connection to them, but individual allocation, to the point that, like, it's not just a question of, like, oh, one of our own is getting sick and we have to do something. It's that something's happening to Chris, of all people, and it's like, oh, is Chris gonna be okay? And it's like, I don't know who this is. And then Anna shows up and they're like, but I'm gonna say, and they're like, oh, thank God Anna's here. It's like, I don't know who Anna is either.
Yes, we're all individuals. I'm not.
Okay, I want to try a challenge for you. Name one of the characters in Goldie Bond who is not Lucas
Nigel.
or Hugo. New characters, that is.
The World War I
I
flying
think-
ace.
I think he was the goggles Ushanka guy.
Yeah, the flying ace.
Yeah, Goggles Boy. Zach, because I've listed him in my notes as
Let's do a competition out of it. Let's each name one until one of us loses.
Okay, so Zach and Nigel have been spent.
Shit.
whose turn is it?
Oh no.
Let's just say first one to name any but one of those three wins.
Adam.
Oh, he was the big guy.
Which one was he?
Damn it, that was
Oh,
mine.
right,
The big guy, yeah.
Violet.
Yeah, he
Violet.
had some importance as a plot MacGuffin.
But yeah, but
God, I know them by like look.
Yeah, same, but I
Wait,
cannot connect
one sec,
names
one
or
sec.
personalities,
Oh, God.
really.
Pepe.
Oh, damn it,
yes.
Pepe. Yes.
Yeah,
Who
you
was
guys remember a lot more than I do.
the important one? He wasn't.
That was Lucas, but
The
Grail
important-
named him.
No, not
The
Lucas.
short-haired
It
girl.
was like Lucas's like.
the short-haired girl,
Lucas's
right?
disciple.
Lucas.
It was like the.
Oh.
Oliver.
Oh yeah, the
Yeah,
one
the
with the
guy.
streak in his hair.
He was like a big deal.
Yeah, and like they did like a big emotional beat at the end with Rattree, where there's like him and like Hat Girl and a bunch of the Goldie Pond crew are like, "You're not our dad" to Rattree, and like they have a flashback to Lucas, and I feel like I really like that beat. In theory, again,
What?
it's in theory. I just wish these characters had been fleshed out more.
What was his name?
Yeah, because we did not even meet Rattree
who was
until
he?
the last arc.
Peter Rattree.
Who was he? Like, this is genuinely, like, because he was such a big deal. But I'm like, I don't remember.
He was William Minerva's brother, and he was the gatekeeper, but
AKA William Minerva, AKA
no,
James
I
Roundtree.
know
the
who Peter
gatekeeper between
Rattray
the
is.
two
I'm
worlds.
trying to figure out what the name was of like Lucas's like big disciple. Like I can't remember his name for the life of me.
Oliver.
Huh?
Oliver. I said it a few times
Oliver.
already.
It was Oliver. Okay.
And with Oliver, I do remember this very distinct moment where he and a few other kids goes to pick up Emma, and they have horses, and Emma's like, "Whoa, you have horses? You know to ride horses? How come?" And he's like, "Well, we weren't just sitting around and doing nothing." And I'm just like, "Who are you?"
Yeah, the story does increasingly employ Game of Thrones travel time as it goes along, which would be fine if it wasn't cutting between all the plot lines so quickly in the climax. Because it's like, if we had substantial time spent away from Emma and co between the points that they pop up, I'd probably, I'd be able to buy into the idea that they took a while to get to wherever they got to.
Yeah, so in terms of, like, just a question of, like, where we thought the shift happened, Goldie Pond definitely started that for me, in the sense that I found the fight with Luvis to just, like, be unbearable. In the sense
Fucking Luvis!
That's the problem. It's like, it's a really badly done action sequence, but Luvis is a pretty damn cool villain.
He kinda is, but I don't know why we had to start stacking demon powers on him. In the sense that, like, he's a giant demon with, like, a giant weapon and an extremely hard mask. I don't know why we also have to give him, like, mega super speed where, like, he's catching all the bullets and stuff like that. Because, like, at that point, like, what the characters are able to do and what their enemies can do just seems so disparate and so, you know, like, borderline, like, different series abilities. That it just kind of, it's almost like the issue that some people have, like, with the online series Death Battle, where it's like, what is the point of comparing these two when there's just such disparate abilities and such disparate power sets that it just seems so strange. And that's how it started to be, where the demons just started to be almost like these crazy super beings that they really weren't before. But in my mind, where I sort of was just like, no, this is starting to get, like, genuinely bad, was directly after the Goldie Pond arc, when he had a really stupid name, like the
Andrew?
Yeah, Andrew, thank you. When Andrew stormed the base, because that's sort of when...
Yeah, that entire section sucks ass.
I completely forgot about it.
Okay, I'm gonna go to the defense in one point. Like, most of that fucking shit sucked ass. But there was one good chapter that I will not even say, like, it would have been good, but, like, I just say it was good. And that was the flashback we had.
I was gonna mention that. It is very good. It is that sort of, like, bit of humanity that I find is sometimes missing when characters die.
But why no big explosion for his death, though? It's like a tiny panel when both times we see it.
Yes, no.
That's a personal thing. That's not really a problem.
Don't get me wrong.
But
the chapter definitely could have been stretched out. I personally think the moment where Yugo is meeting up with his family in the afterlife should have been, like, 3 pages longer. But it had a moment where I was like, this is where the shift is happening, and I can't stand it.
Yeah, and then we just had kids get sniped out of nowhere, and it's barely acknowledged by Emma.
That's sort of what I'm talking about. Is there's that moment where they're running down the tunnel, and they look, and the 2 kids who are guarded, who, by the way, have the exact same character design, barely have, like, interesting hair, have completely blank expressions, like, are just such obvious filler characters, just fall down dead, and they're like, oh man, we're in trouble. And that's sort of the moment where the whole point of the Promised Neverland, which is, like, humanity in the face of absolute horror, just goes out the window, because those 2 people are never mentioned again. We don't even know who they are. We don't know their names. We never find out.
We don't even know, were these, like, Goldie Pond or
exactly
Gracefield House survivors?
And, like, it's especially, like, because Emma in Goldie Pond had a very nice moment where she had to process the fact that these kids died and that she was powerless to do anything. And it was clearly it's really meant to continue along that, because right after these two being sniped, we get a scene where she really wants to save Chris, and she still values every single life, and so it's so weird that she wouldn't react to it. And yeah, I think Andrew as a whole they could have either, like, established him more as a villain, so that when he goes off the rails at the end, it would have more impact, or just go full hog on, he's just an emotionless killer, he's just a militiaman, like a physical obstacle.
I will say, though, Andrew does result in my favorite so bad it's good moment in this entire series, where, like, he's gonna...
Is that when the demon comes out of nowhere and eats him?
It's incredible. Where he's just gonna kill a kid and he's like, I'm crazy now, I'm insane, I have, like, the Two-Face thing, but you don't understand, you're just food. And then the demon just comes out of nowhere, like 100-foot tall demon that ain't nobody saw coming. And then, like, he just turns around like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Oh my god, with Andrew and Peter Rattray essentially doing the same thing, I have kind of a thought that the Promised Neverland villains kind of evolve in the same way that the fairy tale villains do.
Which is devolve.
Which is just, I am calm and composed. No, I am insane!
Yeah, that's an interesting debate in regards to Peter Rattray, because I've heard some people argue, like, but then the whole point is to unravel that the hatred of those at the top is petty and is bad. And I don't have a problem with petty villains on paper, but he's very poorly established, so I don't really... Yeah, again, I don't know his deal.
Not to mention, we're then supposed to feel some kind of sympathy towards him when we see his flashback. Like, no. You established something completely different, and now you're asking
Wait,
us to
is this
believe
Peter Rattray or
this.
Andrew? Okay.
Peter Rattray. We're kind of jumping about.
Andrew had no flashback. He was just, I am calm evil. No, I'm crazy
There was a moment where I was like,
evil!
holy shit, did Andrew have a flashback? And I just forgot it completely.
I would not have blamed you if that actually was the case. Because I would say, like, I think one of the questions was, who was our least favorite character? And with how little character there is, I don't have too many among the main cast, but among villains, it's either Peter Rattray or Andrew. I cannot decide.
I think I'll go with Andrew as the worst for me.
Yeah. I did like the moment of Peter Rattray's death and the whole Emma's whole speech, as I said. So
not to mention, Rattray was actually set up from a pretty early point. Like he was introduced midway through Goldie Pond, and he popped up some of the ways through. And I did like some of the beats with the kids confronting him, like, on paper. I keep saying this. I like this thing on paper. Just the execution isn't there. So I think there is more redeemable about him for me than Andrew.
Yeah, I was just gonna... Also, when he's losing, he becomes just laughable with how he screams, cries, and whines. Like, I would think, in the anime, they should just, like, insert the light screen from the Netflix Death Note movie. You would fit
I just want Kermit the Frog sounds, like, just, I don't know. If we are talking about, like, if we are sort of moving to, like, the character thing, like, favorite and least favorite, my least favorite, just from a writing standpoint, oh my god, the Queen of the Demons is awful. Like, it is, like, this is supposed to be, like, just such, like, a high, like, horrible, evil character. And, oh my god, there is nothing to them. Like, there is nothing except, like, just, like, I'm hungry, I like eating. And then there's sort of the resolution of being, like...
I kind of like the idea of the Queen just being someone who has just become the manifestation of greed over the centuries, and that is what undoes them. I think my only real misgiving with the Queen confrontation itself is that there was no interesting staging to it. Like, I'd have liked maybe her chasing Emma and the others a bit, so there was some peril before Sonju goes up and realizes, like, you're just like an unstable wreck, and omae wa mo shinderu, and then she explodes.
It was just something I couldn't stand in the sense of, like, where the villains have come to in this series, in the sense that, like, the big bad just seems like such a nothing character. when I look back on it, in the sense that, like, I just want to ask very honestly, if I didn't mention the Queen at some point, would anyone else have, like, brought them up?
I would have, because I wanted to say that point about how I felt her conflict was resolved, but yeah.
I would not have, because she was not really important in the story.
Yeah, I mean, this thing, the series, as well as the villains as individual characters, it's very weird about their dynamics. Because it's like, I had this back in Goldie Pond, where you have both Lord Bayon, who's meant to be running the thing, and Luvis, who is much more in the forefront. And that's just weird, because it's then like, what role is Bayon meant to have? He has so little presence, despite being the guy who runs the whole safari, and I feel like it doesn't have to be the same. He doesn't have to be the center stage villain, but in that case, like, what is his deal? And then it's sort of a similar thing. Like, I feel like Ratri would have felt much less out of nowhere at the end if he'd had some sort of featuring midway through the Queen conflict, like maybe just a cutaway to him being like, yeah, I can't get in contact with the Queen now, just to remind us that he's there.
Or just more interactions with, I suppose, Norman, when Norman
Yeah.
was still captive.
Yeah, because
Also,
Norman's the first character of the main cast who meets Rattree, so you could easily have more of a dynamic between them.
Yeah. Anyway, what was the question again?
It was favorite and least favorite characters.
Okay.
I guess we
in
were.
the manga.
I guess we were talking about that, but now I kind of remembered that there was this whole portion of the series where like Norman was executing his plan. That one faction of demons and I think another faction of demons. One was the Queens, and one was this exiled demon called Geelan, I think.
Oh yeah, Geelan.
And Geelan, yeah. There were like 10 chapters of
God, that's right.
of the backstories over and over again, and I couldn't get into it at least the first time because the faces don't tend to serve themselves well to like empathizing with them.
That's an interesting point of discussion. Like, is it fair to say this doesn't work because they don't have conventionally human ways to express, or is that just a bias should be overlooked? And yeah, that is something I am torn on as well.
Maybe. It's an interesting question, to be sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's hard, because, again, I don't think all the demon characters are necessarily bad. I just think that, like, sometimes the storytelling gets so compressed that it's hard to elaborate fully. I guess in terms of a favorite, I bounced around a lot. In the original time when we recorded this podcast, I named Emma. Just because you know, in a world of grim, dark protagonists and overly edgy storytelling, where every single person has to be horrible for, you know, fans to label them realistic, I adored the fact that there was like a ray of positivity in a dark world.
# ray of positivity.
No,
Yeah.
I do really love that hope punk element of it. Like, I think that's a good way to set it apart from other post-apocalyptic grimdark stuff.
And while I do think that, you know, Emma's character as a whole did sort of take some licks as the series kept going, everyone else did too. So I can't really, like, say that, like, anyone rose above. So I would probably still say Emma, for me.
Okay. Yeah. Mine is probably Isabella. As soon as the story focused back on her and as what she'd been doing with the grandmoms back in the Return to Gracefield stuff, I was instantly more interested again, just because I find the mothers as characters so interesting, because they have been doing atrocities and they have been complicit, but it's also they kind of felt like they had to be. So there's just... Yeah, I'm just instantly so much more invested in them than I am the demons.
My favourite character was back then was probably Crone, and it's unfortunate that she got out of the story so quickly. I liked her a lot. She had kind of a similar thing as Isabella going for her, but again, she was inexperienced. She was conniving. She was goofy, and she brought a certain dynamism to the early part of the series that wouldn't exist without her. I really like her for that, and it's a shame that I haven't watched the anime yet, but I've heard that they've added some racist stereotyping of her.
Yeah, they make her very, very caricature-ish. It's a bit weird. The anime is sort of a controversial one because it's, in some way, it definitely takes liberties with the material, whereas, like, Pozuka's and Shirai's framing is very much this warped fairy tale with a lot of internal monologue. The anime strips out the internal monologue in favor of sort of
Wait,
horror suspense,
wait, how do you
which
how do
rubbed a
you
lot of
do
people
the
the wrong
Promised
way.
Neverland without internal monologue? That's like 70%.
Yeah, it's a very different kind of vibe. I don't hate it per se, and apparently the anime is going to go even further in a like a different direction with the second season, which I'm interested in because, like I said, the genre shift in Goldie Pond is very awkward to me. So if they took that in more of a suspense direction in the framing, it might work better for me. It might also end up being a huge mess. Who knows?
I've also just
Um,
realised that I haven't mentioned my least favourite character. I don't think I think about characters in the Promised Neverland enough to name one, but maybe as a group I would name I would name like Norman's enforcers. For some reason I thought that they were just an unnecessary addition, and they were like a force to look out for. By Emma and Ray, but they disappeared rather quickly. But then they reappeared, and they had all this internal stuff I didn't really care about.
Me, they didn't really bother me, mostly because, well, by that point, the more unnecessary characters was just a stand.
I would say that in the latter portion of the series, I did think that Luvis was a shining star of a character, especially on the demon side, that was at least impactful for me. So I would name him as a standout character at least.
But for my favorite, I would also have to go with Isabella, with just how well executed a villain she was, in comparison, especially in comparison to everyone else after, but even on her own. She had this aura of menace without having to state much. Just her standing in a room would always put you on edge because of what she represented, what she could do in comparison to these children.
I think the Norman's squad are an interesting phenomenon. They are a good example of where I think Pozuka's art succeeds and where it doesn't, because sometimes her individual character designs can look a bit kind of derpy, which is all right when you've got a bunch of orphan kids who are like sort of this ragtag group. It's less cool when she tries to draw genuinely like stylish looking action heroes type characters.
I hate the
They
fucking
just
guy
look really weird.
with the black hair and the cross on his head or something. I don't know what that design was.
Wasn't there a dude in an army uniform who didn't really show up much?
Who was that?
Yeah, I think so.
Remember, might have been.
Yeah, because I like her two extremes of like derpy kids and then very like gaunt demons figures slash the mothers. Like those work very well for me. And then it's like all the ones in the middle, like Norman's squad and a lot of the Goldie Pond kids that I just think look really daft.
Yeah.
I guess to go further on Demizu's art, I've always found it looks much better in color, but I do think there is a shift midway through Goldie Pond where when her art is allowed to breathe and we're really allowed to see it all, like it looks much better, and yes, and then later on it becomes very drowned by cluttered panel layout, and it just doesn't benefit it at all.
There was a moment, sort of like before we recorded this, when Wensleydale they sent a picture of a panel from the part of the series where they're trying to win Yugo over. And I looked at that panel, and I was like, oh my god, I have not seen a panel like this in The Promised Neverland in forever. Because not only do the characters have room to breathe, but the line work is like thicker, and it's not as scratchy. And it's just so much nicer. And it's genuinely kind of like, it was almost a shock for me. It's like, I had totally forgotten. I was so used to The Promised Neverland just being a hoarder of like exposition panels and frantic movement, where every single chapter was just trying to pack so much inside that no room was able to breathe. It was just a series starved for oxygen.
she kind of goes through the same evolution as Kishimoto, I would say. Because his art also becomes more and more scratchy after time skip.
Yeah, though I think we can all agree that the color pages were pretty much always excellent.
Yes.
Oh yeah, I'm like spoiled for choice on which one I want to use as the podcast image. They're so good.
Yeah, like...
I particularly love the one of Emma trying to escape Goldie Pond, and it's like this ocean that she's drowning in. It's such a cool visual.
Yeah.
I do like the one with the umbrellas with numbers of the characters, serial numbers.
Yeah. It's like the scene that you mentioned that had the image posted from it, the confrontation with Yugo. That's an example of using Emma's very pure friendship is good ideology in a confrontation that's super effective. That is such a great scene. And I wish we'd had something similar with, like, Ratri, as opposed to, maybe we could have been friends.
Yeah, unfortunately, I do have to bow out here.
Alright, this podcast is getting long, and I do still have more notes to get through, so yeah, it was great to see
but I
from
did want to say
Nova.
just before I went, I did like the ending chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I'm a sucker for happy endings.
Yes.
And regardless of like sort of rough patches throughout, and in my mind, very inappropriate parallels drawn between the real world and their world. I do think that the Promised Neverland thesis as a whole is a good one, and as ill-advised as it could sometimes be, I do greatly admire a series that, in an extraordinarily grim, dark world, does really try to put forward the message of, like, maybe there is hope. And Wensleydale, again, brought up the very good point earlier that The Promised Neverland does not entirely do that. It does sort of have other characters who are like, you know what, maybe this will be okay, but I probably won't be alive to see it. And that I do also think is powerful and works very well. But I will say that overall, I did enjoy reading The Promised Neverland. I'm looking forward to the author's next series. And I'm grateful for the shakeup in shonen that it started very early on before just kind of reverting. So that's all. That's all I want to say.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
See ya.
All right. See ya. Yeah. So where was I gonna go? Yeah. I guess to talk about the ending a bit more. Oh yeah, I do really like what it's going for, but I do also have some huge problems with it. Like, okay, it's nice that it's not just doing the look at all these characters and their kids and who got paired up with who. That would not have been appropriate for this series at all, and it's nice that they don't go for that. But then, on the other hand, there's not even a double-page spread in the last chapter, which kind of ties in with my problem with the art, and, like, how they rushed through it. I feel like one of the emotional beats in the last chapter, at the very least, deserved a big full-page spread to really let it sink in.
Yeah, I'm glad it did get 27 pages for the final chapter. It definitely did get more than Bleach did.
Yeah. I did find on a reread, this series, like you said earlier, Wensleydale, it's very bingeable. It's not one that holds up well week to week at all, but I got a lot more out of the Forest arc and the Goldie Pond arc on a reread. And even the early parts of the final arc, where, I must stress, I think when they initially reintroduced Norman and had that whole dilemma, I was super into Promised Neverland for the first time in ages, and then they dropped the ball again.
But then they do resolve everything rather quickly. Same with kind of the conflict between him and Don and Gilda.
Yeah, and it's again that thing of, okay, I guess I can accept you going for the optimistic solution, but then you can't raise these questions and ignore them. You have to at least address them.
There would have been so many more interesting ways to show how the human world had advanced instead of just exposition dumps. Like, we could have had maybe one of the kids at one of the rehabilitation facilities for the mass-produced farm kids, and, like, actually see that and be like, damn, the world has changed. And again, it's just putting us into the perspective of more characters would have been nice to give us all this information in a natural feeling way.
That's a good point.
I guess so just because we've mentioned questions, but I've not actually shouted out any of the Reddit users who said these, which would be a shame if they, on the off chance that they were listening to this. So, where did it went wrong is from Edge_Incarnate, And favourite/least favourite characters in the whole manga was from PickMiner5087. So yeah, that was that.
Thank you for the questions.
Yes. We've got another one from J137. How would you rate each individual arc?
Let's just go each arc like individually, give our ratings that way, rather than all of
Yeah.
us give them in a row.
Okay, so I'm gonna say Gracefield House. I'd give that an 8.
I'd give it a full 10 myself.
I'll be boring and give it a 9.
An average of a 9.
Although I don't know, maybe I'll give it a 7. I'll give it a 7 just for not being a very good Act 1.
Okay, the forest mini arc with Sonju and Mujica. I'm gonna give that a 7.
Yeah, I'd 7.5. I can't really go for an 8, but I think I'm not quite at 7 either. So 7.5.
I haven't reread it in a while, so I'm just going by my first and second read-through experiences, but I'm gonna give it a 4.
Okay. Then the Goldie Pond arc, I'm gonna give that a 5.
Do we include the first encounter with Yugo in
Yeah,
Goldie Pond?
We'll say from the first encounter with Yugo to the end of them getting out of Goldie Pond.
Alright, in that case, I would say 4.
4.
Like, I like the early stuff, but I really do not like once they get to Goldie Pond. So maybe 4.5 again.
Yeah, it's a very even balance of things I like and things I don't like for me.
I could go for 4 or 5, but overall I'm pretty low on it.
I'm gonna give it a 6 just for Luvis.
Luvis! Then...
Okay, I might bump myself to 6-2 with Lewis.
I'm gonna say I'll just divide the rest into... Yeah, I'll just make shall we just do the final arc for the last one? Because there are lots of little ones, but they're all kind of part of a big one.
Shall I check the wiki?
The thing is, I've checked the wiki, and they're all very split up into little ones, like Kuviditala, the Seven Walls, the Invasion, and the Return to Gracefield, and I all kind of view it as one big clump, but...
Well, then it's hard to give a rating for it, because there's so many different things that I cannot give a singular rating if we put everything.
Okay, fine. We'll do like the attack from Andrew arc, which I'm gonna give like a 3.
What?
The attack on the base from Andrew mini arc.
I'm giving it a 2, and that one is only because of the chapter with Yugo.
Yeah, 2.
Yeah, and then I think I'm gonna bunch together the reintroduction of Norman and Emma going to the Seven Walls to make a new promise into one arc, if that's okay. And I think I'd give that like maybe a 6 or a 7.
I'd go for 6 too.
I'd give it a solid 5.
And then the big palace invasion, the capital invasion. I will give this a 4.
I'm also on 4 because it had a few decent things, but overall it just failed to live up to the potential and had some real head scratchers. Like, wait, what?
Upon a reread, I am gonna just give it maybe a 6, because I enjoyed it much more. And I did think that it was a rare moment from the Promised Neverland that they like introduced a power from one of the demons, the multiple cores in the royal family, and they built some more stuff on it by having Luvis survive.
Yeah.
All the arcs I like are related to Luvis, basically.
Fucking Luvis!
Fucking Luvis!
I will say, I think I'd like that arc a lot more if it had the similar attention to world building and a sense of place that the Forest arc did. Because I really like the way that both the Forest arc, it kind of feels like they're slowly discovering the world, and I like that they use the storybooks to do that. It ties in nicely with, like, the fantasy fairy tale in a warped way motif.
Did they really? Because I recall like maybe 2 times they used the storybook for that and then just dropped it.
Yeah, it'd have been nice if they committed to it more. I think they use it enough in the Forest arc to get them to like the basics. But yeah, I'd have liked more of a sense of what the palace was like and how they got in, and I don't really have much of a sense of place for it. There's mostly just like the big hallway where Norman confronts the Queen. Anyway, To go on to the next one, then we'll do like the Return to Gracefield House arc, which I guess I'll give it like a 5, maybe a 4.5. I think
3.5 is highest I'd go, cause that one just started devolving.
Because I think Isabella's sudden death is the most actively angry I've gotten with the series. But yeah.
Plus Peter Rattray just being awful.
Apart from like the final confrontation with Emma and Peter Rattray, I'm gonna give it maybe 4.5. Yeah.
Okay, and then we have our biggest question, which is from Mary Amperson. Discuss the philosophical/ideological themes in TPN, like veganism, farming, demon society and hierarchy, royal family, the emotional journey of the characters, and the legacy of dead characters. Obviously, there are more themes present. Try delving into these topics. And now, I'm not. Okay, I am not.
Yeah, that's a lot
so
to spring
I
on
am
us,
not
like,
planning.
at
Okay, to be clear,
minute.
I was very last minute about farming these questions. I am not going to dump all of these topics on you because I'm not going to go into all of them. Sorry, Mary, but the one that sticks out for me is the way it handles royalty is weird.
Yeah.
Like, I like the idea, on the one hand, of the demons having this hierarchical society where the higher-ups are making things needlessly shit just because it keeps them in power. It's like, very real right there. But the way that the chapter where they're just like, I'm a part of the old... Luvis is like, I'm a part of the old system. Also, we need a new queen. It's it comes out of nowhere.
It kind of does the same thing as Oda does, where he keeps having these monarchs, these tyrants that are just bad eggs, but that's all they are, individual bad apples, and you just have to replace them with the good kings. It's not like
And I will say I'm not really a monarchist, and I do disagree with that on a ideological level, but I do think Promised Neverland executes it a bit worse than Oda does, because even Oda is like, he'll at least establish a good king, as opposed to like...
And even then, usually the bad king is the invader, aside from Wapol. Like, just the guy who just kicked the old
that also
king
kind
out
of ties in with like a very traditionalist approach that One Piece had, which is sort of weirdly at odds with its upstart thing. But like,
Yeah, that is something that would be discussed, but this is not a One Piece podcast.
But I will say, like, it is just, I feel like, not only do I not agree with the way it's like we need a new monarchy, but also it comes very out of left field in this particular series.
As for legacy of dead characters, I didn't feel like this was a theme that was particularly strong in the series, apart from maybe like the Rattrays. Keeping on the legacy of the...
I kind of got that in a couple of instances. Like, okay. I don't remember where it was. It's one of Emma's many like monologues about how far they've come. I think this was actually at the end where they'd finally defeated Peter, and she had flashbacks to a bunch of dead characters like Yugo and the bunch. It's like, but thanks to all of their efforts, we were able to come this far. And then there was also with the Queen, when she was becoming an Akira monster and basically her greed was catching up to her. We had the images of lots of various characters that had been made food for the nobles that she'd essentially eaten pop back out again and be like, the people that you have consumed are now working against you. So it was touched on in a couple of instances.
Yeah, I'm just not sure how well it does with veganism, because while it does raise like those points, they're kind of modeled by the one fact that the ones being in here are sapient, which I do get can be used effectively, but two, they just give it up really easily once they learn, they're used to control us. Well, I'm not gonna eat meat anymore. Like, it's another thing that bring up and never address.
I kind of find it's interesting, but because Sonju is taught about his teacher, look, Prince, I will teach you about the circle of life, which I think Jack Sane did a great video on the aspect of establishing a social hierarchy and justifying it with this kind of philosophy, if this works as a metaphor.
So I've just got like a few like stray points to go through, and then I'm done. So I legit forgot that the detour to find medicine for Chris didn't lead them right to Norman's base. because that would have made so much more sense and streamlined the plot, and instead we just have this weird little vignette where all that's really achieved is that, like, Emma and the gang are introduced to Bag on Face Kid. That's kind of it. You could have just had it be like, okay, they're taken to Norman's base.
I guess they just wanted to have some feature for Anna, who's the most favourite character in the entire series, for some reason.
Yeah, she was surprisingly popular. I love that Phil is fourth billing behind the three mains. It's great. Like, the fandom meme of Phil is such a big, widespread thing. I do genuinely love
the
that.
lack of love for Don and Gilda, though.
Yeah, they're fine.
Yeah, I liked them in the first arc, since they were like the ones who were not as smart, but still had their own roles.
Yeah.
Especially since Phil was the one who was like not as smart, but more eager to act, even without thinking it all through.
Yeah. Another victim of Shirai's very plot-driven focus later on over character is Aishi, the feral demon girl. She felt more like she was just introduced to be a convenience. We got barely any chance for her to be a character, and that sucks because that's such an interesting concept for a character.
Yeah. I really liked her for one chapter, and after that, she just disappeared off the series.
Yeah, the chapter with the backstory is one of my favorite chapters in the latter portion of the series.
The man with Emma hair in the flashback to how the promise happened is really weird. It's just, I don't know why they did that.
I completely forgot about him.
And then my last point is the way that the demons are handled when they're sort of they're evolved based on what they eat is quite similar to the Chimera ants from Hunter x Hunter, and I'm just going to use this as an excuse to shill Hunter x Hunter, where if you want an arc that delves into this kind of freak organism that becomes a very dominant force, and the philosophical ramifications of that, and has a cool conflict between them and humans, and has some subversions, but is still a very satisfying arc with some great payoffs, just watch Hunter x Hunter. Hunter x Hunter's great, or read it. I do recommend the 2011 anime a lot, though. Just any chance to get more people on board the Hunter x Hunter train is a good one. So, yeah.
Okay.
Long as you're prepared for the hiatuses.
Yeah, again, if you're just binging through it, that's not really an issue.
But then it's just gonna end with, and to be continued.
Also, I find that the current arc is more extra content to me. Like, it basically ends after the election arc. Like, that's a good end point, which is where, like, the 2011 anime ends. So, yeah. Anyway, that's all my...
So again, a recommendation for The Promised Neverland, just end after Gracefield Arc.
Mm-hmm. And then recommendation for Hunter x Hunter, watch or read Hunter x Hunter. Yeah, so I guess, yeah, any more concluding thoughts? It's a series that, like, I'm glad that I've been able to put my bitterness to bed on and just weigh up the pros and cons, because I feel like throughout its run, it's not been a straight downhill drop. It's been varying in consistency, and it's been interesting to reevaluate where I feel like its strengths and weaknesses are. Any other closing thoughts?
Not really. I think I got everything I had to say about it, because towards the end, I just had so few feelings about the series.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna say that Goldie Pond is my favourite One Piece character. Booyah.
Yeah. Alright, so, things to shill, because we gotta do that. The piano-y theme you heard is composed by a guy called Milo Jack Stillitz at soundcloud.com/Milo-Jack-Stillitz. Don't know who that guy is, but I like...
Oh, he also did my intro.
Yeah, funny that. And then, yeah, please check out me and Wensleydale's new podcast, DUCKFACE Diaries. Do you want to explain a bit about that, Wensleydale?
Yes, absolutely. That's World Trigger read-through podcast aiming to discuss the World Trigger manga volume by volume. We've just released the second episode of that, discussing volume 2. So go listen to that. It's on anchor.fm/WensleydaleCheddar. That's where all the links are to all the podcast platforms, to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Breaker, Radio Public. Pocket Casts, Google Podcasts, and of course you can also find it on YouTube at youtube.com/c/WensleydaleCheddar.
Yes, indeed. And also, this podcast is now on Anchor. I'm not on quite as many platforms as DUCKFACE yet, but it is definitely on there and Spotify. I will add more platforms as we go along.
And it's on Breaker, I think.
Is it on Breaker as well? Okay, great. I will post links to places in the YouTube description to places you can download an audio version of this podcast.
Okay, Pocket Cast so far.
Okay, great.
Right.
Yeah, Grail. Anything else you wanna plug?
No, I'm not the guy who does content. Yeah, I'm just the guy who crashes your parties.
Yeah, you can follow him at Nuclear Android on Twitter. I believe Jonah is Jonah Left Snow on Instagram.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm at WensleydaleCheddar.
Yeah, and I'm at Hovin with an H on Twitter. And yeah, so that has been our podcast on the Promised Neverland. Thank you very much. It's been a longer one than usual. To think, before I had the idea of doing this, I was worried I wouldn't have enough to say on this series. it just goes to show.
And meanwhile, I just host like half an hour podcast, and that's it.
All right. Okay. So, thank you very much for listening. See you later.
See ya.
Laters.
Let's live together.
Let's not. Okay, come to Finland. It sucks over there.